What I'm about to say this morning is not my own thoughts, but it's a collection of things that I put together from various sources. Because frankly, I'm just not that clever to think all these things up. So I glean it from other people and I put it together. But it is something that God touched my heart with, and I'm hoping that it'll be something that you'll be able to see as we look into this, a better picture of who God is in some respect. And it comes from his creation. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn to Genesis chapter 1, and I jumped around a little bit. I'll give you the references and things like that, but don't feel like you have to turn there. I'll give the verses, but you could record them down for later if you want to double check me on anything there. Genesis chapter 1, just for length of time here, let me just summarize what's happening in that book. We know Genesis 1 is the creation story, and in verses 3 to 5, it's the first day. And in that, God says, let there be light. And so we have day and night from that. The second day is verses 6 to 8. And God says, let there be an expanse, sky above, earth below. And then the third day is verses 9 to 13. God says, let there be a separation from the sea, the dry ground. And there's a second part, a bonus act, if you will, that there's vegetation, specifically seed-bearing plants and trees with seeds inside their fruit. Those two items. The fourth day, God says, let there be light, and there's the stars, the moon, and the sun. And he describes it. In the fifth day, God says, let there be creatures to fill the sky and the seas. So there's birds and all the creatures that fill the sea. And in the sixth day, verses 24 to the end of the chapter, God says, let there be domestic and wild animals and every kind of creature on the land. And there's a bonus. God said, let us create man in our image. Then he gives some details, among which is be fruitful and multiply. When you look at this passage, it's a little different for us because we don't think in these terms generally about it, but it's poetry that's happening in there. And in the Hebrew mind, it was a poetry of thought. So you share one thought, and then you would share another one that gives another description of the same thought, and that's the poetry. So the first day is he creates day and night, and that's the first day. Well, the fourth day relates to that, and he describes it in another way, and he says, God says, let there be lights, stars, moon, and sky. The second day goes to the fifth day, and that picture is, it's filled with creatures and everything from the sea. And of course, the third day is related to the sixth day, and those balance out. And remember, there were two things that were done on the third day. All the others had one, but on the third day, there God separated the sea and the dry ground, and he gave vegetation. Well, on the sixth day, he parallels that. He brings the poetry together, and he says, God said, let the domestic and the wild animals, every kind of creature on the ground. And the bonus thing that he gives that compares to that is, God says, let us create man in our own image. And he gives the details of be fruitful and multiply. So specifically, the dry ground is linked to the animals, and the seed-bearing plants and trees with their seeds inside the fruit, very descriptive, is linked to man's creation. Why does he do that? Why does God relate man to trees? And I found it fascinating. But before I go into that, let me just tell you a little bit about, I like that picture up there, about the word tree. The way it's pronounced in Hebrew is eitz, and it is spelled E-T-Z or E-T-Z or A-T-Z, either one. But the word is kind of very large when you talk about it. It means timber, wood, timber stalk, plank, stalk, S-T-A-L-K, stick, gallows, tree, trees, wood, wood pieces, gallows, firewood, cedar wood, woody flax. So it's got a large encompassing picture of this, and usually it's translated in our text based on its context of what it is. So even though it may say eitz, it could be firewood, or it could be a staff. It could be a tree. And you gain what it is from reading the context of it. The reference of tree and wood, bush, is used in the Bible a lot. You think about man, it's used on every page, and God is used on every page. But next to that, you would probably think of something like love. Love is used around 300 to 600 times for the whole Bible, depending on your translation. But the trees are used over 1,000 times in their forms. So basically, I mean, if there's 1,500 pages in the Bible, then you've got one about on every other page. They're they're grouped together in areas and stuff, but it's quite it's a shocker when you look at how often God uses trees. So what is that? Well, people aren't, but I think we can go through the Word and look at all the major events that happen in the Bible, and you'll see some form of trees making the incident or marking the incident or the event. What did God put in the Garden of Eden? He lists trees, is the first thing. And the first trees that he lists are trees that are pleasing to the eye. The second thing he lists are trees that are good for food. And I find that fascinating. God chooses pleasing to the eye to be listed first and food second. I'm not an artsy guy. I'm not. I'm a practical person, so I have to go, no, the important trees that we need out there are fruit trees because they do something, or we need Doug for our cedar because cedar makes great housing, and those kinds of things. But that's not what God's saying. It's, look at the beauty of what I've done. And he wants us to be captivated as his children by his creation. The next trees listed in that special garden are the tree of life and the tree of good and evil. And this is only chapters 1 and 2. He's talked about trees. If we look for trees, we will see them from the very first chapter of the Bible all the way to the very last chapter of Revelation. Tree references are everywhere. Let me give you an example. Remember, a few weeks ago, Laverne shared with us. I love it when Laverne speaks. She has a way of captivating our attention. She shared on Tamar and Judah. And if you remember the story, Judah had 3 sons. He got Tamar for his first son, and his first son was very wicked, and he gets killed by God because of his wickedness. And because of the culture, the second son was to raise up children for his elder brother, the firstborn. And there were 3 sons in Judah's case. And the second son, he doesn't do his job either, and God takes him. And Judah's thinking, if I give him my third son, he may die as well. Not a lot of confidence in his children, I guess. But so he says, wait for him to grow up. He's young. Wait for him to grow up, wear your widow's gown, and then when he's older, I'll give him to you to raise up seed for your son. Again, seed, a reference to trees. So anyway, this goes on for a while, but finally, nothing is happening. And he's old enough, and Tamar has had enough of this, and so she hears from somebody that he's going down to have his sheep sheared, and he's going to go down there, and he's going to Adullam. And that Adullam means retreat. He's going down to this retreat. And so Tamar has this idea, and she goes down there as well. She dresses up like a prostitute, and he comes through the town and sees her, and he says, I want to sleep with you. And she says, well, what will you give me? He says, I'll give you a goat. And she says, what do you have now? And he says, well, I've got my staff, and I've got my ring and my cord that ties the ring on. And she says, I'll take those in as a pledge. So he sleeps with her. Tamar becomes pregnant. She goes home, and Judah goes home, and Judah sends back his servant to give him the goat, to give her the goat. Goes back, there's nobody there, and they ask around, and they said, there's never been a prostitute here at the temple. There's nobody here. And so he goes home, and he's thinking about this, and then he's upset about it. In the end, Judah is found out, and his words are that she's more righteous than I am because I didn't follow through on my promise. But the interesting word for us here is the rod. That's eights that he has in his hand. This is the staff. So if it wasn't for Judah, I wouldn't think anything about it. A lot of people carried a staff, but this one is very specific, and it is what Tamar asked for the pledge. And the reason it's significant is because of Jacob, his father. In his dying blessing, he tells Judah this. He says, listen, this is Genesis 49:10. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff, eights, from between his feet, until he who it belongs shall come, and the obedience of all the nations shall be his. So the staff is very significant, because remember what the staff does. It doesn't just, of course it supports him as he's walking along, but it's also a picture. It is a picture of power, of leadership, authority, such as a king would have, and who possesses it. Think of Moses with his staff. Remember, he struck the rock and water came out. He spread it over the Red Sea and it parted. He threw it down, or Aaron threw it down, and his staff budded. That's the kind of power that this thing represented. And what I find amazing here is that Judah is trying to give that away. Remember, Laverne shared that he left his brothers. He left his brothers, and he went to Adur, and that means a refuge. He's trying to find a place where I can get away from this responsibility that God has put me into. The story doesn't end there with Judah. If you think about it, Judah had as his great-great-great-great-great-grandson David, the son of Jesse. And God had promised David that his seed, again a tree reference, would indeed establish his throne forever. But because of sin, God said that David's line of kingly heirs would be cut off. That poses a problem, because God said, your kingdom will never end, and yet you'll be cut off. So we're kind of thinking, how is this going to balance out? God has told both. But we read in Isaiah this verse, and let me read it to you. And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, a branch shall grow out of his roots, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. And the prophecy continues with more in other verses. Although the prophecy continues and it hasn't all been fulfilled, we can see the significance of it because the Messiah arrived on earth, and we can clearly see this is who this prophecy was talking about. When Isaiah said, out of the stem, the word is literally a dead stump. God brought life from a dead stump. And it takes God to bring life from a dead stump. So let's pull this thread that we're hooked onto of it all the way into the New Testament. Remember in John chapter 12, verse 13, they took palm branches when Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, and they went out to meet him shouting, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel. We can clearly see the kingly entrance into the city of Jerusalem. Though he doesn't have a staff in his hand yet for his authority, he will. But what is tossed at his feet? Palm branches. Let's think where the story started that I told you about with. Remember we started with a woman named Tamar? Tamar's name means palm tree. Who but God can pull this thread all the way through to allow us to look at the connection all the way? He does that. He continues to do that. Let me give you one more example. Genesis 22. This is the story of Abraham and Isaac. Remember, God is testing Abraham. He's got only one son, and God says, I want you to take your one son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah, about a 3 days journey from where they were. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. They get up the next morning and they leave. Isaac is a dead man walking. They arrive near Mount Moriah, and Abraham cuts the wood, and that's the eighths, for the offering and places it on his son. Well, he takes the knife and the firewood up the mountain with him. He talks with Isaac, answering his questions about, where's the lamb, Father? They get up on top. Abraham arranges the stones. He arranges the wood. He binds his son, who does not struggle. He reaches for the knife, lifts it up, and then the Lord stops him. Abraham, Abraham, here I am, he says. And Abraham looks up, and he sees a ram caught in a bush. When I read this story, the parallel is unbelievable with the story that we have later. When God tells Abraham to take his only son, Isaac, whom you love, I go to, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And he says in Matthew 3:17, God speaks from heaven and says, this is my son whom I love. A 3-day trip with his son, as good as dead, comes to mind Hebrews 11:19. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead, the same as Jesus was dead for 3 days and then returned to life. They leave for a mountain, and the mountain area was Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah is where Solomon built the temple. This is where the Holy of Holies was. This is where the high priest sacrificed a lamb on the Day of Atonement each year for the sins of the people. And Jesus said, God told Abraham, go to the area of Mount Moriah, to the mountain I will tell you. I suspect that mountain was Golgotha. Abraham cut the wood, the eights for the offering, and he placed it on his son Isaac. John 19:17 says, carrying his own cross, he went up to the place of the skull called Golgotha. Acts 5:30 describes the cross. For the God of our fathers raised up Jesus, whom you murdered and hanged on a tree. Eights. We can see why John the Baptist said, behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. Only God can pull a needle and a thread through history and weave a story that makes us want to praise him. I was reading in this book that a lot of the information come and kind of opened my eyes to it. It's called Reforesting Faith. And he has a passage in there that I'd like to read. It says, from the moment he was born, his enemies set about trying to kill him. They tried to kill him as a baby, stone him, to throw him off a cliff, but it didn't work. Jesus could go 40 days without food, climb into the ring with the toughest opponent on the planet, and walk away a winner after 3 rounds. There was no point in trying to drown him. He'd walk away from that too. No, the only thing that could harm the carpenter from Nazareth was a tree. Why? Because he who is hanged on a tree is cursed, not who was stabbed, not who was stoned or burned. Note, the Hebrew word for gallows and tree is one and the same. Without trees, there is no resurrection, no good news on Easter morning. The cross is really a tree of life chainsawed down by man's sin. Yet Jesus' blood caused a dead tree used as a Roman torture instrument to grow into the symbol of everlasting life. The tree of life. Jesus is the tree of life. You know, trees are a living picture of us to reference God. Trees are meant to tell us that of eternity. Trees give you the long view. Have you ever counted the rings on a tree stump? Figure out how old the tree was? There's a tree, I think it's in Arizona, it's called the Joshua tree. And it is nearly 5,000 years old. Realizing it was growing before the pyramids were built. And it's still alive. Or if you look to the clone forest in Utah, which is over 100 acres of a tree that is all the same, that reclones itself, that's over 40,000 years old. And it's considered the largest living organism in the world. We use trees to measure time against. We use them for judgment and justice. Trees designate property boundaries in the legal description. Abraham was the first tree planter in Genesis 21, showing an area that he had purchased and a place he named God, the eternal God, where he called upon him. Trees are for life. Trees are showing us death and beauty, health and healing. Trees are God's provision for us. Trees are his chorus of praise, Psalms 96:12. They are God's reminder to us, a living sticky note, as it were. Trees call us to celebration. Trees are a picture for explaining things. They're used in parables to tell God's relationship with us to Jesus and Jesus' connection to the Father and the Father to us and the Father to Jesus. They are a daily physical reminder that God is here. Romans 1:19 and 20 says, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God made it plain. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. So, who's against trees? There aren't any anti-tree lobbyists. There really isn't. Everybody loves trees. Everybody loves the idea of planting trees. In fact, there is a current movement to plant 1 trillion trees by 2030. Most of this is to counteract the CO2 emissions using trees as a carbon storage area. In 2020, Turkey planted 11 million trees in 1 hour. Now, most of those trees died, but people want to do something. So from this point, I'm going to diverge a little bit. Because I would say if I was out there and listening to me here, I'd say, Bill, I agree with you on all of this and everything, but I'm not much of a tree hugger. This world is going to hell faster than we thought possible. I know what we need to do is, I don't know what we need to do, but we need to do something, and it should be more spiritual. And that kind of leads me to the second thought of what I wanted to share with you was, I just want to touch on something that may have crept into our thinking, and it's called dualism. I'll give you a bit of a background on dualism. I don't know where it started for certain, but Plato believed in dualism. And basically, on a simple form of that, it's that there are two realms. There is a physical realm and a spiritual realm, and there's a picture of something in both in Plato's mind. So there was a physical chair and there was a spiritual chair in there. And the physical chair in Plato's mind was bad. And this was the good one. The spiritual one was the good one. And everybody kind of wrestled with this thought. And from the philosopher's point of view is everything you are around is out of order and in chaos, and order only happens in the immaterial area. So you have to go there. That's the place to go. So they didn't look at death as a bad thing. They looked at it as an escape from this body to the better place. So they were looking forward to death. And that has kind of crept into the church in some respects. Because in the early Gnostics, in the beginning, and like in Galatians it's written about the Gnostics, in the early church believed that Jesus could not actually have had a physical body because the body was bad. So they believed he came around and he walked through the sand, but he didn't leave any footprints. He just kind of drifted in and out of there. And that was saying, no, we've handled this word of that Paul and all of them talk about. We've handled of the word of life. We've touched him. He's real. He was here. I read a article, and I'll just read this paragraph to you so you can kind of get a little bit of an understanding of what we're talking about here. And it comes from Christian Culture, and it was written in 2015 by Sadlin. Many ancients, following the Gnostics, believed materiality as evil or at least subpar. The truly good and virtuous things were beyond our sensory world. It's not hard to see why Christians would purchase stock in this view. After all, God himself is immaterial. So are faith and hope and love and prayer. Most of these things we hold most dearly are immaterial, but not all. Recent Christianity cares about redemption, but it has a deeply impoverished view of creation, of nature. To many, Christians' nature isn't that important. The only thing important is getting souls saved. They actually don't want escape from sin. They want escape from their bodies. They want to escape their humanity. They want to escape from this world. They think that the prayer and Bible reading and quiet contemplation are spiritual, but trees, ocean, good food, making money, enjoying nature, basketball, they are not spiritual. But in the Bible, the conflict is never between physical and non-physical. It's between righteousness and sin. Sin is the problem. Materiality is not the problem. The most evil being in the world is pure spirit. And the godliest man who ever lived, Jesus Christ, lived and died and rose again in a body. If you don't care about the material world, you can't care much about culture, even Christian culture. Be on guard. Don't let this kind of thinking creep into your perception of God's creation. Martin Luther had said, if I knew I was going to, that tomorrow the world would go to pieces, I would still plant my apple tree. If you read about a tree in the Bible, look for God to show up. Are you seeing God in trees and around you? His reflection is there. What kind of seeds are you planting for the next generation? Are you planting seeds in faith knowing that you will never see the fruit in your lifetime? Have the long view. Hebrews 11:39 tells us, of those who came before Jesus' physical arrival, none of them received what they had been promised, talking about the saints of old. God had planned something better for us so that altogether with us they would be made perfect. That is the long view. That is planting in faith. God gave you the same command, be fruitful, no matter what age you are. Psalm 92, verses 12 to 15 say, the righteous will flourish like a palm tree. They will grow like a cedar in Lebanon, planted in the house of the Lord. They will flourish in the courts of our God. They will still bear fruit in old age. They will stay fresh and green, proclaiming, the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no wickedness in him. If you read about a tree in the Bible, look for God to show up. Thanks.